I'm Dr. Mark Cattell, and I want to welcome you to the 8th chapter of Schultz and Schultz's History of Modern Psychology. Today we'll be talking about applied psychology, the legacy of functionalism. So we'll be discussing the growth of American psychology, intelligence testing, clinical psychology, and industrial organizational psychology. But let's get started with a vignette about Coca-Cola. Now, in 1909, U.S. federal agents seized a truck containing Coca-Cola, and they got 40 barrels and 20 kegs of Coca-Cola syrup. Now, the government claimed that caffeine was addictive and deadly. And one newspaper wrote that 8 Coca-Colas contain enough caffeine to kill. It also was believed that drinking Coke led to immoralities in young people who drank it. Now, Coke needed scientific evidence of its safety for a trial which took place in 1911. They approached several prominent psychologists but were turned down. Harry Hollingworth, though, needed the money and so did the research. Now, he was teaching at Barnard College in New York City, and Coke was also willing to hire his wife, Letta Stetter Hollingworth, and let her work on the project too. Now, from the project, they made enough money for her to be able to finish her PhD at Columbia. So that's a good outcome there, too. Now, the Hollingworths insisted on the highest ethical standards and the rights to publish the results. And Coke agreed to not use the findings in advertising. Now, obviously, no negative effects were found with caffeine, and Coca-Cola won the case. But this shows that sound experimental research can be funded by corporations. The growth of psychology between 1880 and 1900 was phenomenal. Then there's just some statistics. In 1880, there's no psychological labs. By 1900, there's 41. No psychology journals in 1880, 3 by 1895. Maybe that's not too exciting, but in 1880, you have to go to Germany to get a PhD. By 1900, there's 41 doctoral programs in the United States. And by 1913, the U.S. was predominant in psychology. I think preeminent would be the better word. The U.S. had more of the world's leading psychologists, 84, than Germany, England, and France combined. And by 1900, 25% of the research articles were applied research, and only 3% used introspection. Psychology was also popular both with the general public and with college students, and it still is. But in order to make it more valuable to funding sources, psychology had to be more applicable to real-world problems, which is one of the reasons why educational and school psychology took off. Let's talk about James McKeen Cattell. Now, Cattell earns his bachelor's degree from Lafayette College, where his father was president, and he became interested in psychology as a result of his use of drugs like hashish, morphine, opium, and caffeine. Now, he goes to work for Wundt in Leipzig in 1883 and gets his PhD there in 1886. Now, apparently he just showed up in Leipzig and told Wundt, quote, "Herr Professor, you need an assistant, and I shall be your assistant." And Wundt was so taken aback that he hired him and described him as ganz Amerikanisch, which means typically American. And that applied to both Cattell and his research project, which was about individual differences in reaction time, and which was a topic that Wundt was not particularly supportive of. Cattell supposedly bought Wundt his first typewriter, or did he? There's some question about that. Cattell's been characterized as doing a disservice to psychology. He said this himself, because with a typewriter, Wundt could produce twice as much work. But apparently Cattell just showed Wundt how to use a typewriter. He didn't actually buy him his first typewriter. After leaving Leipzig, he goes to Cambridge as a lecturer and works with Galton. He stresses quantification, ranking, and ratings, even though he was self-described as mathematically illiterate and often made mistakes in addition and subtraction. He also became interested in eugenics, and he promised each of his 7 children $1,000 if they would marry the sons or daughters of college professors. Now, he's something of a rebel. He claimed that he was the first professor in psychology at the University of Pennsylvania in 1888, but his appointment was actually in philosophy, and it was obtained for him by his father. He moves to Columbia as the head of the psychology department in 1891, and he stayed at Columbia for the next 26 years until he was fired during World War I for being disloyal to the United States. He'd written letters protesting sending draftees into combat, and he eventually sued the university for libel for firing him and won a judgment of $40,000, which would be close to $1 million in today's money. He starts the journal Psychological Review in 1894 and bought the journal Science from Alexander Graham Bell. Now, this is important because Psychological Review became the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association, and Science became the journal of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Now, Cattell bought and sold other journals as well, and his wife Josephine worked as the unacknowledged managing editor of the journals. He founds the American Association of University Professors, and he believed that faculty, not administrators, should be making the decisions about university governance. Now, the AAUP is still around today, and for full disclosure, I'm a member as well as serving on the executive board at my university. Cattell also introduces the term mental tests in 1890. Like Galton, he initially thought that sensory ability was related to intellectual ability, but he concluded by 1901 that it was not correlated at all. So let's start talking about IQ testing. Alfred Binet creates the first psychological tests of mental ability. Now, he was French, he was independently wealthy, and he was self-taught when it came to psychology. But he believed in assessing cognitive functions, so things like memory, attention, comprehension, and imagination as the appropriate measure of intelligence, which now seems obvious. And he reached this conclusion after testing his daughters on sensory motor tests, and they were children, by the way. And he found that they had the same ability as adults, so he rejected Galton's idea that intelligence was related to sensory ability. Now, in 1904, he develops 30 problems with Theodore Simon, and the test focused on 3 cognitive functions: judgment, comprehension, and reasoning. In 1907, the test was revised and expanded and included the concept of mental age, which is the age at which children of average ability could perform specific tasks. In 1908, Henry Goddard, who's an American, translates the test into English. He's also a football coach. We'll talk about him again in a minute here too, but he was the only undefeated football coach at the University of Southern California. Then he earned a PhD with Hall at Clark. In his writings, he also introduced the term moron, which he took from the Greek term for slow. Now, in 1916, Lewis Terman created the Stanford Binet test and adopted the concept of the intelligence quotient, or IQ. Now, the Stanford Binet has been through several revisions, but it's still in use today. The problem with it is that it must be individually administered by a highly trained person. And to talk about IQ for a moment, the concept of IQ, which is the ratio of mental age over the chronological age, was originally developed by the German psychologist William Stern, or I guess Wilhelm Stern because he was German. But it becomes used by Terman in his research too. Now, by World War I, the U.S. Army needed a group intelligence test that was easy to administer, so that didn't need one person, or that where people didn't need to be tested one at a time like the Stanford Binet. So Robert Yerkes, who was president of the APA and actually a comparative psychologist, was made a major and assembled 40 psychologists. He's at the center of that photo. And they came up with the Army Alpha and Beta tests. Now, one of the breakthroughs came from Arthur Otis, who developed the multiple choice question. So we have him to blame. The Alpha test tested verbal and numerical ability, and the Beta test was mazes and digit symbol substitution. Now, the Alpha test was for people who were literate, and the Beta test for people who were illiterate or didn't speak English. More than 1 million Army recruits were tested, but the war ended before the data could be utilized. And one of the surprising findings, though, from the Omri alpha and beta tests was that 1 in 4 recruits were functionally illiterate. And again, that's in 1917. Now, psychological testing won overwhelming public acceptance. In the 1920s, 4 million intelligence tests were given per year. And in 1926, the Scholastic Aptitude Test, or SAT, was introduced. Now, the SAT was developed by Carl Brigham, who was a psychology professor at Princeton and worked on the group IQ tests during World War I. And he thought that focusing on vocabulary and mathematics would be useful for selecting college applicants. Also, psychologists referred to people as patients rather than subjects when doing IQ testing. And the intelligence tests were seen as analogous to thermometers, which at the time were only available to physicians. So it was a measurement device. Now, Henry Goddard tested immigrants at Ellis Island and found the vast majority of them to be feeble-minded. His idea was to give the Binet intelligence test to immigrants, even though they didn't understand English and the test had to be translated for them. Goddard found, for example, that 87% of Russian immigrants and 79% of Italian immigrants tested at a mental age of less than 12, and so were categorized as feeble-minded. Similar findings were reported that African Americans and immigrants from the Mediterranean and Latin America also didn't do as well as white Americans on IQ tests. Now, Horace Mann Bond, who's pictured there, his research refuted this racist IQ data. Bond earned his PhD from the University of Chicago and was later president of Lincoln University in Pennsylvania. His research showed that any recorded differences in IQ were due to environmental factors. And he also found that African Americans from northern states scored higher on intelligence tests than whites from southern states. Additional contributions. Florence Goodenough, she had a PhD from Stanford in 1924 and developed the Draw a Man test. And it's now called the Goodenough-Harris Drawing Test, and it's a widely used nonverbal intelligence test for children. That's actually her picture there. I was looking for a picture to post, and I thought, oh, that one's good enough. That's kind of a joke. Ch8 Cattell got a PhD from Harvard in 1927, and she was the daughter of James McKeen Cattell, and he refused to support her college education because he didn't think she was smart enough for college. Her research extended the age range of the Stanford Binet test downward with the Cattell Infant Intelligence Scale, which could be used with infants as young as 3 months old. She's also famous as the first single woman who was allowed to adopt a child in the United States. She had never married. Anne Anastasi got a PhD from Columbia at age 21 in 1930. That's awfully young, but she'd started her undergraduate education at 15. She was only 15 years old. She was the president of the APA in 1971 and had more than 150 articles and books and had a long career in psychology, primarily at Fordham. Let's switch to clinical psychology, and we'll talk about Lightner Witmer, who started the field that he called clinical psychology at the University of Pennsylvania and opened the world's first psychology clinic in 1896. Now, the kind of psychology practiced at Witmer's clinic was not clinical psychology as we understand it today. It was more like school psychology because he was interested in assessing and treating learning and behavioral problems in children. He did not use psychotherapy, which was a technique he detested and knew little about. Now, children who were referred to Witmer's clinic showed a wide range of problems like hyperactivity, learning disabilities, and poor speech and motor development. And he developed standardized programs of assessment and treatment and initially believed that genetic factors were responsible for problems, but came to believe that environmental factors were more important. How did he come to psychology? Well, he had been teaching history and English before taking law classes, but a paid assistantship was available in psychology with Cattell, and this is at University of Pennsylvania when Cattell was there. And so Witmer took over Cattell's position when Cattell left for Columbia, and he was actually handpicked by Cattell as his successor when he was still a graduate student. Cattell's only stipulation was that Witmer had to travel to Leipzig to get his PhD with Wundt. And Witmer later said that he got nothing out of his Leipzig experience but his degree. He did not get along with Wundt, and a lot of people didn't get along with Wundt. But Witmer remained at the University of Pennsylvania for his entire career and died in 1956 at the age of 89. He was the last of the charter members, meaning the original members of the American Psychological Association, which was founded in 1892. Now, the growth of clinical psychology in the United States was slow. In 1918, there were no graduate programs in clinical psychology, and the training programs that they did have were limited, and clinical psychologists, most of their job duties were just administering tests. This changed when the United States entered World War II in 1941. A large number of draftees showed up at induction centers with severe anxieties, depression, antisocial demeanors, uncontrollable anger, and many other problems. And 2 million men were rejected for psychiatric reasons just at induction. Another 1 million were hospitalized for mental disorders when they were on active duty, and another 500,000 were discharged from the military for the same reasons. After the war, the VA, which was the Veterans Administration, funded university-level graduate programs. Plus, they paid the tuition of graduate students who were willing to work at VA hospitals and clinics. The Department of Veterans Affairs remains the largest employer of psychologists in the United States. And today, 1/3 of all psychology graduate students are enrolled in clinical programs. Let's switch now to industrial organizational psychology and Walter Dill Scott. Now, he's the first person to apply psychology to things like personnel selection, management, and advertising. And he started a consulting firm, not imaginatively called the Scott Company. Now, he was struck by the idea of workplace efficiency when he was still a kid and he was plowing a field. And he realized that resting the horses for 10 minutes every hour was adding up to an hour and a half every day to time he could be spent doing other things. So he started bringing books along and read while the horses were resting. Now, he wanted to be a missionary in China, but no positions were available. So he went to Germany to study with Wundt while his wife Anna worked on her PhD in literature 20 miles away in Halle. He wrote the book, The Theory and Practice of Advertising, in 1903. And in that book, he cites emotion, sympathy, and sentimentality as ways to influence people through advertising. He thought that women were more suggestible than men and recommended companies use direct commands in ads. And so a typical ad would be something like, use Pear soaps or drive Studebaker cars. He also promoted the use of return coupons because they required consumers to take direct action, meaning to fill out a coupon and mail it in for a free sample. He also is a pioneer in employee selection, and he said that intelligence is judgment, quickness, and accuracy, and that you should compare applicants' test scores to the scores of good employees, and that's how you should pick people. Now, people like Scott and Witmer don't get much coverage in the history of psychology because they formulated no theories, founded no schools of thought, and had no students, and they did little research that got published in the main academic journals. Many academic psychologists discounted the work of applied psychologists because they felt, this is the academic psychologists, that applied psychologists did little to advance psychology as a science. Now, the World Wars had an impact on psychology. One obvious use for industrial organizational psychologists was to work in testing, screening, and classifying recruits. But weapons systems engineers also worked with human factors and other psychologists to understand human capacities and limitations to design military equipment that was easy to understand and use. Now, the primary focus for industrial psychologists in the 1920s was the selection and placement of job applicants. And a famous study was done at Western Electric Company's Hawthorne plant in Illinois in 1927. Now, they intended to investigate the physical work environment, so conditions such as lighting and temperature. And what they found, though, was that social and psychological aspects were more important, that just being questioned or observed on the job as part of a research program made workers feel valued, and that the management cared for them or cared about them. Lillian Gilbreth is a fascinating person. She's the first woman to receive a PhD in industrial organizational psychology in 1915 from Brown. She also got a master's in literature from UC Berkeley. With her husband, Frank, she promoted time and motion analysis, and that's a technique to improve efficiency in job performance by filming people on the job and analyzing their movements. A publisher refused to put her name on a book with her husband's, and he said that having a woman's name on the cover would detract from the book's credibility. Now, when her own book was published on the psychology of management, she was listed on the cover as L.M. Gilbreth. Between 1905 and 1922, she gave birth to one child every 15 months, which is a unique accomplishment in the history of psychology. Now, she gave birth 13 times, and she had one child that died at the age of 5 of diphtheria. But 2 of her children wrote the book Cheaper by the Dozen, and it became a film too, and it was later remade as a Steve Martin film too. But it was a book about their home life, her and her husband. Gilbreth worked well into her 90s, and she came up with a lot of great inventions too. Like she designed the shelves on the inside of refrigerator doors and the foot pedal trash can. So as I said, just an amazing person. Let's finish out the people with Hugo Münsterberg. Now, he wrote hundreds of magazine articles and over 20 books on topics of the topics of clinical, industrial, and forensic psychology. He was a frequent visitor to the White House and president of the American Psychological Association in 1898, but he was also apparently extremely self-centered and had a strong sense of self-importance. He considered himself a German patriot, too, and that gets him in trouble in the United States during World War I, but we'll talk about that in a minute. He gets his PhD with Wundt in 1885. They didn't get along either, and got a medical degree from Heidelberg in 1887. He started at the University of Freiburg, where he set up a psychology laboratory, but in 1892, William James flattered him into taking a position at Harvard. James said that Harvard was America's greatest university and needed a genius to run its psychology lab. So he comes to America. Now, he writes his first book in English in 1902. It's called American Traits. And it was actually written in German for a German audience, but then it was translated back into English for Americans. The book contained his criticisms of the American judicial system, which he felt was adversarial rather than investigative, and his incredibly sexist and racist beliefs about the role of women and ethnic minorities in American society. Munsterberg defends Germany during World War I, and people wanted him fired. One Harvard alumnus offered the university $10 million to fire Munsterberg, and Munsterberg joked that he would resign if he could keep $5 million of that. He collapsed and died of a massive stroke while delivering a lecture at Radcliffe, which is really that's how a true professor dies, on the job giving a lecture, but he literally fell over during his lecture. Munsterberg's interests, really 3 different things: forensic psychology, psychotherapy, and IO psychology. Now, forensic psychology and eyewitness testimony, Munsterberg had written articles on crime prevention using hypnosis to question suspects and other topics, but he was especially interested in the fallibility of eyewitness testimony. And so in 1908, he writes the book On the Witness Stand. He writes about false confessions, the power of suggestion, and other psychological factors that can affect a trial's outcome. Your textbook also points out that the book has been reprinted as recently as 2009, which is interesting because I'm actually the person that published it. It's got a new foreword by Elizabeth Loftus, who is a legendary researcher in forensic psychology. So yes, I own a publishing company in addition to being a professor. In 1909, he publishes the book Psychotherapy, where he says there is no subconscious. So he disagrees with Freud on that one and actually avoided Freud when he visited Clark University in 1909. Munsterberg treated his clients for free in his lab and did a very directive therapy, meaning that he would make direct suggestions to his patients about what they could do in order to be cured. Now, Witmer, who we discussed earlier, dismissed Munsterberg as little more than a faith healer and thought that he had, quote, cheapened the field of clinical psychology. In 1913, Munsterberg writes Psychology and Industrial Efficiency, which is actually a bestseller. He developed mental tests and job simulations to match the mental and emotional abilities of workers to their jobs. He also found that letting workers talk while working decreased efficiency and suggested increasing the distance between machines or desks to discourage talking. He also suggested putting up partitions, which were a forerunner of today's office cubicles. So we can blame Munsterberg for that. Let's finish with a national mania. Now, Cattell wrote that the contributions of psychologists to World War I put psychology on the map and on the front page. People came to believe that psychologists could fix everything from marital disharmony to job dissatisfaction, and also believed that psychologists could sell anything, but that fell out of favor during the Depression. Now, the APA changed its membership requirements in 1919. The APA at the time was controlled by the academic branch of psychology. And they said that candidates for membership in the APA had to publish experimental research. And this was done to cut out applied psychologists. However, today, fewer than 30% of psychologists work in academic settings, and the APA is now basically controlled by clinical psychologists. Academic psychologists are now much more likely to belong to APS, which is the American Psychological Society. Well, that's Chapter 8, and thanks for listening.